She wanted to be wanted. It validated her. She seemed to always want to run to the next person to tell them what had happened, the gossip that she knew or the things that she could find out, because she had a position of power within the underworld. She was their lawyer, they trusted her.
It's a story that Anthony Dowsley and I have looked at great length. We can't find another story or version of the story that begins to emulate it.
Where were you the night you first heard about the greatest scandal in Australian legal history?
I was having my very occasional beer, where there was a police fraternity having some Christmassy drinks, maybe just after Christmas. It was a really warm night, and the beers were flowing. And there was what would you call almost a tip-off about what would become a story that would take years and years to tell. That was that night. I didn't know what I was walking into. It was a casual drink. It was at a pub near where the police rounds at the Herald Sun used to be. There were lots of detectives, I think, celebrating the end of the year, and something happened.
So the tip-off you got at the pub after 10 beers, the tip-off actually turned out to be wrong, but you decided to investigate anyway. Why was that?
To call it a tip-off might be a little bit awry. It was actually a favour someone asked me because they were intrigued with a woman named Nicola Gobbo. She was a lawyer in Melbourne, and she'd gone off the legal scene pretty much by the summer of 2013, 2014. And what someone asked me was whether I could get a birth certificate for a baby that was a love child, an apparent love child of a high-ranking police officer. And I was bemused and no, why would I be able to do that? And then it's sort of the conversation developed into whether this particular lawyer had contacts with the police that maybe was bizarre, or she shouldn't have, what her relationships were. The conversation was about one thing, but my mind was heading to another thing.
So that, I think, is what you call a reporter's nose for a story. How would you describe a reporter's nose for a story? Is it something that you're born with? Is it something that you develop over time? And is your nose for a story usually right?
This triggered, in my mind, a lot of history. The history was why would a lawyer 3 or 4 years earlier have been subpoenaed to give evidence in a gangland trial, which had derailed her career, and which she had been given a sum of money, which no one knew the figure, which ended up to be $3 million. Why had all that happened? And it seemed to have all gone away very quickly. So there had been a gangland war, which Nicola Gobbo was the lawyer and barrister to all of the bigwigs, Tony Mockbell, Carl Williams, and all of their henchmen. Why had she ended up being a witness against a police officer? Why had there been trouble with police? Why had she sued police? And now I'm hearing a false rumour about whether she's had liaisons with high-ranking officers. The liaison wasn't really interesting. What was interesting was she knew all these high-ranking officers, but why? And it would turn out that it very quickly came to me that there had been what they call an informer unit, a source unit within police that had been basically torn apart and scrapped and rebuilt. And was she the reason that all that happened? And that was exactly the reason why all that happened, because she had been a source to Victoria Police.
She's not the normal barrister that you'd see in most Victorian courts. What was she like?
There were a couple of high-profile lawyers, and she was one of them, that took the headlines from time to time. Nicola Gobbo was tall, she was blonde, and what started to sort of stand out to me was that not only did she represent all of the big names in the gangland war, but she seemed to know police really well as well. That was becoming apparent. Why did all of these relationships exist? How did she get there? And that's what really this light bulb moment in my head, that's what came on when I started to think about her and the Informer unit as one thing.
So some stories land in your lap,
Yeah.
and they're almost in a completed form when they turn up and you find them. The Lawyer X story wasn't a story like that. You started essentially with one tiny piece of a huge jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
How many years did it take you to find all the rest of the pieces?
So the main pieces came together within a couple of months. Basically, the only piece I truly needed was that she was a registered informer for Victoria Police, and that was solid, because if that was wrong, I don't think I'd be in the business right now. I would no longer be a journalist if that had been wrong. So that had to be right. The rest of it was going back through history and seeing what she had infected as a lawyer who was snitching on her clients. That was the key, to find out who she'd snitched on and how that had impacted big investigations such as the Hodson murders, such as Operation Briars, which famously was regarding the shooting of someone who believed they were a vampire, a gigolo named Shane Chartres Abbott, who was killed outside his house. They were the two big ones, those two investigations. But there were many, many more, including, I've mentioned Mockbell, but all his trials, all of his crew. There was Carl Williams and all of his crew. And then everyone else he had ever represented. You had to put all those pieces together to understand how this worked.
Look, the conventional way of looking at this story is that Nicola Gobbo was a defence barrister who informed the police on the side. I actually, in looking at this over many years, I've come to the conclusion that she was probably, it's better to think of her more as an informer who actually used the cloak of being a defence barrister to actually inform.
So Nicola Gobbo became Police Informer 3838, and she snitched on most of Australia's most dangerous criminals.
Well, it was dangerous. It was deadly. It could have, at any moment, ended her life. And it wasn't like throughout this time of informing that the people she was informing on didn't get a whiff that she was doing it. She was called what they call a dog, which is criminal language for an informer, many times during this period between 2005 and 2009. But that was a key part of, the police and Nicola dealing with each other. That was the threat to her life the whole time, ongoing to this day.
Why would the police think it was a good idea to have Nicola Gobbo, a criminal defence barrister, as a police informer?
Whether they thought it was a good idea or not is still up for debate. They did it because they were very entrenched, or what they wanted to do was get convictions over the gangland war, which had been raging in Melbourne between 1998 and 2006. What Nicola was able to do for the police was, if someone was arrested and they were an underling, her job was usually, and it used to be, to keep that person from actually trading up a deal. What she did for the police was actually roll these underlings on the likes of Mockbell, on the likes of Williams, so that police could get the key criminal figures.
So at any point in doing this story over, 6 or 7 years, did you have anyone who was essentially a deep throat source who provided you with lots of information that took it from a story that you may not get published to something that you think you could publish?
It was lots of little pieces of information from lots of people. And the idea, I guess that bank of knowledge I had gave me that instantaneous knowledge that when she became a witness, now that made sense, because she had this long relationship with Victoria Police. No one knew for sure that she was a registered informer, but they certainly knew that she had a way about her, that she was always on the phone, she was always giving advice, she was around police officers, she was around organised crime figures constantly. And what came out of it is they didn't know where she found the time. But she certainly had an infectious personality that, particularly with men, that she could hold relationships with. And whether it was the police or the lawyers that she was around or the criminals, all of these fraternities sort of work in a way together, and they all knew something. And that's over years I was able to build up really a big caseload of information about what had occurred. So when we could finally tell the story, we put 30,000 words down on paper.
Do you remember the first day that you told the editor of the Herald Sun, Damon Johnson, about the story?
I think it was a Sunday. I know it was a weekend because the Western Bulldogs were playing North Melbourne that day, and I was heading out there. And I'd given a draft of this story to the news desk, and I wanted to work on it more and more because just so much information was coming. I don't think anyone fully comprehended what we had, but I think I knew that it would cause a great deal of heartache.
Did you ever fear for your own safety in writing about some of these people?
I don't think any of the people that were convicted or that had been gangland figures had anything really to want to scare me with, because they were hearing something they probably wanted to hear and something they suspected. A lot of them suspected this had happened. By the time I wrote it, Carl Williams was dead, but he had suspected it and had written to legal boards telling them that Nicola was conflicted. He certainly wrote letters that we had saying that he thought she was an informer. I didn't think police would harm me. That's a bizarre thought. I didn't think that at all.
There are a lot of people who actually didn't want this story published, in particular Victoria Police.
Yeah. I knew that the story had safety implications for Nicola Gobbo, and I rang police straight away and said, this is what's happening. And there was no sign of, panic. They were relaxed. And so I wrote up a story, and it wasn't the story I really wanted to write. It was nowhere near as detailed as what I wanted to write. In fact, it was a strip, which is a little sidebar on the front page that day, which I thought was underselling it. And I was asked by Victoria Police would I send that story through. And given the circumstances, as a journalist, you know this, you don't usually send your stories to the people you're writing about. But given the circumstances that there were safety aspects to it, I thought it was the right thing to do, and I thought I should. Within an hour or so, we were in a Supreme Court battle and looking like we had to pulp the newspaper for that edition that night. There was the potential there'd be no newspaper the next day, which was critical. So they didn't scrap our story in the end. We were able to write less, but it was still enough. It was more than enough. It was all right. That's when it sort of dawned, I think, that this was a key issue of the Gangland War. The reasons that we were taken to court would become more interesting over time.
I think the Herald Sun had to go to court over the years 28 times for the right to publish.
So we'd found these ways to write around, I think of new ways around these suppression orders. And every time I did, I'd get a letter from Victoria Police saying you could be breached and put in front of court for this.
A lot of newspapers might have given up. A lot of reporters might have given up and said it's too hard. What was it about the story that made it so irresistible and made it absolutely essential that it be published?
That night at the pub, when I first had a key belief that she was a police informer, it was instantaneous to me what that meant. I knew what would happen is that all of those convictions were in jeopardy.
It's so far-fetched as a story that it sounds more like a Hollywood film script than it does something actually happening in Victoria's legal system. Was there anything inside you that went, this can't be true?
I am someone that doubts themselves with stories where there's so much on the line. If you don't doubt yourself, you're not going to check everything, I don't think. And I was checking everything I could. But everywhere I looked, there was nothing for me to say, oh, you've got this wrong. The only thing that worried me was the idea that people would say, and they did, well, what's wrong with it? The bad guys went inside, the good guys got the bad guys, happy days. And there's an element of truth to that. There were people that were committing bad crimes that went to jail. But the way they went to jail, by using their own lawyer against them, undermines the entire justice system. And that was obvious from the start.
So in 2017, Patrick Carlyon started writing stories with you about Lawyer X.
I'd known Patrick since I was a cadet, and when he was a cadet, and we trained under the same editor, and I knew that he had great writing skills, and I had amassed an amount of information which I needed decluttered and to make logical. So it was really good to work with someone who did have a different set of skills, me, the information hunter-gatherer, and he was the one that was defining what we might use and what we could not use, so decluttering what was in this messy head of mine. And we were just inside this old conference room on a disbanded floor, and I just went through it with him, and I had all these paperwork, and I explained the Hodsons and what had happened and why that had happened. So the murder of two informers, Terry and Christine Hodson, in their home in 2004, and the impacts of that and how that flared out and where that flared out to. And that's the way we worked. And I would generally write the news stories with him, and then he would take charge of the reads or the features.
The world that Anthony basically introduced me to, was full of lawyers, police officers, criminals, and Anthony himself. And at times, it was difficult to know who was who, to be honest. Anthony, and I think that's part of his charm. He looks he's not the alpha male sort of strutting into the room and demanding answers. He's got a very quiet and patient way. He's very unintimidating, and his great strength ultimately is his absolute dedication to the pursuit of the truth.
So did Patrick think it was a great story?
I thought it was an amazing story. He kept on saying this was a quarter of what it was. It's amazing. He couldn't believe what I was telling him, and it took weeks to tell him. I felt sorry for him because I had the advantage of having watched and studied crime for so long. I knew the players, and I knew who'd done what, and I knew who'd got convicted and when and how and all of these things. And it was complicated, and I just dumped it all on him.
I think Anthony's great strength is his ability to actually ferret out information from people who ordinarily wouldn't want to give it. And I think perhaps what I brought to this was an ability to analyse Nicola Gobbo's character, to analyse the motivations behind a lot of these things. And for a lot of the time, from 2017 onwards, we would have, I talked about the jigsaw before, we would have sort of 57 pieces in the 100-piece jigsaw. And it's like, well, where are the other pieces? Where should they go? And I think that was a strength that I brought to it. But he was the one who had got the pieces in the first place.
So the underworld is interesting that everyone knows everyone, and one event isn't isolated. One event impacts another event and impacts another event. Even explaining Carl Williams's murder trials and plea deals in itself, which is just one small bit of it, is quite complicated. there was all of this rigmarole around her rolling these clients. Who were they? How did that work? What impact did it have on who? So how many people did they inform on? How many cases did that impact? There was Tony Mockbell going to Greece. She had a phone call with him when he was captured. What did come out of that phone call? All of these things. But on top of that, she had also, among the big things, she had been given a shipping document by a criminal, and it was the shipping paperwork for the biggest ecstasy drug haul in the world at that point. It was called the Tomato Tins Gang. All of these millions and millions of ecstasy tablets were packed in tomato tins, and they came in a container on a ship from Naples into Melbourne's ports. She was the source behind, or the tip-off behind that being seized. No one knew that. That was another angle, and all of those convictions, and there were 32 of those people convicted. Well, which ones had she impacted? Who'd she given advice to?
So at one point you thought, this is the best story that I've ever had in my career, but you had no idea whether a word of it was going to end up in the paper.
But as time went on, being suppressed and having the power of the state tell you cannot write a story for reasons that would become clear that wasn't just about the safety of the informer Nicola Gobbo, it was more likely the safety and protection of the people, especially the hierarchy of the Victoria Police, who could potentially face charges, whether they were current policemen or former policemen.
So did you lose faith in Victoria Police because of the way they acted over this?
I haven't lost faith, but it did make me aware that when it comes down to it and the fight is on, the fight is really on. I'm still astounded. It wasn't just me. When it came to a Royal Commission, it was the same. If there was a fight to be had, it was going to be fought hard.
We're unaware of any other story in the world that comes close to sort of replicating the lengths and the extraordinary sort of abuses of the justice system that took place in the Nicola Gobbo Victoria Police story.
Come 2018, Patrick and I probably had he didn't think we'd get a Royal Commission. I thought we would. And he said to me, "You got your bloody Royal Commission." So I think the government didn't have any choice. I don't think they wanted to call one. Even though I thought it might happen, it's a bizarre feeling that something that was a false rumour in a pub ends up as a Royal Commission. It sort of blows your socks off. You don't know what to make of it, and it stuns you. I saw the editor downstairs, and he was stunned. It was just all sort of floored by it, but it was happening.
And that was the difficult thing in writing the story. Ultimately, is we only had limited facts for most of that duration. And it was only really at the end of the Royal Commission that you could sort of, you had this big pile of folders that explain what did and did not happen. But even then, there's still questions that we still talk about to this day.
He bought a new shirt before he came and did his interview with this. Does that surprise you?
It does. And you had a room full of 20 to 30 lawyers all wearing very sharp suits. And here was Anthony, he'd sort of roll in 5 minutes late, looking half asleep, in a tatty T-shirt, maybe ripped jeans. And he was the person who actually made this all happen.
I'm a bit casual, yeah.
I'm presuming that's because it makes you fit in.
Yeah, it's part of the persona.
It's a good name, Lawyer X. It's got a touch of Hollywood about it.
Yeah. And in the end, it carried through. And it was really amazing how people viewed it, like I've touched on before, that some people thought she was like almost a hero because she'd put some bad guys in.
She gave evidence ultimately at the Royal Commission in about 2019 or 20. What struck me, listening to her voice, she wasn't actually in the room because she was in protection. and there were great fears for her life. What struck me about listening to her talk about it was the matter-of-factness. She described herself as a spectacularly good liar at one point. But she sounded so normal, very bright, and very matter-of-fact, very Australian, if you like. And I think in my mind, I'd sort of expected that there might be more nuances to the way she spoke or the way she presented it. But she sounded very down to earth and again, totally at odds with her behaviour.
But one of the things that we had written about, we hadn't nailed in all of the information we had, was that her informing career had gone back in history to her university days.
And she actually informed on her then boyfriend, who owned a house with her, about drugs and guns and that sort of thing. And that led to his conviction. And it's almost like she got a taste for it. She enjoyed the power. She enjoyed sort of puppeteering, if you like, pulling the strings.
Would you love to get another story like Lawyer X?
They take a lot out of you because not only of the weight of the information that we got out there, which was similar to sort of, two guys trying to hold a Royal Commission on their own before the Royal Commission got it and did it. And we got most of that information, and we got all of it right. But it would be great to do another story like that, but it's a toll. It takes a heavy toll.
So did you stop sleeping at night?
Yeah, it worries you, yeah. Your sleep patterns are affected, yeah.
For how many years?
Probably to this day.
And his patience and his ability to win the trust of these people who had things to hide is something that you don't see that often in journalism. He looked after every source, he won their trust, he never let them down, and he was writing stories that damned a lot of them at the same time. It's very difficult to pull off.
And the 2019 Gold Walkley goes to Anthony Dowsley and Patrick Carlyon.
So do you feel any unease about the torrent of bad guys trying to get out?
No, the thing that makes me uneasy is that her and her family are at risk. That's the thing that I always worried about from day one, from the time I was on the tram, going to work on that Sunday when we were going to write that first story, to this very day, because Nicola Gobbo never wanted to go into any kind of police program, protection program, and that's been in many court cases from that time to this time.
So do you still worry about her safety?
Yep. As far as I know, she's travelling the world, effectively stateless. There's no agreements in place. And it would be good if there was an agreement in place.
But she's a very unusual character who loved the limelight, deceived all the people who came close to her, and ultimately became a very sad figure who's going to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder.
But listen, it's pretty rare you get something as deep and complicated as undermining the justice system in such a enormous way that impacted, over 1,000 cases now. And they're all impacted in slightly different ways. So, and it's all secretive. And that was the difficult part.